In case you missed this article, let me just take 1 minute to quote 2 short sentences from that piece. It says, the Royal Bank of Canada is refocusing its wealth management arm and cutting jobs as it parts ways with the division's Caribbean business and launches a strategic review of its RBC Suisse operation. The changes come as Canadian banks struggle to turn around their Caribbean divisions. Royal Bank of Canada, Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, and Bank of Nova Scotia, the 3 Canadian lenders with sizable operations in the region, have all suffered write-downs from their Caribbean arms in the past year because the islands are still suffering from a drop in tourism following the global financial crisis. In a statement, RBC acknowledges the changes will lead to some job losses. Qu'est-ce que tout cela veut dire? Qu'est-ce que tout cela implique pour la région, pour les relations entre le Canada et les Antilles? Nous sommes ravis d'avoir plusieurs experts ici qui pourront nous illuminer à cet égard. J'ai l'honneur d'abord de vous présenter la présidente du panel, Madame Marie-Lucie Morin, qui à son tour présentera les panélistes. Madame Morin has recently retired as Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Before that, she had a distinguished career as a senior civil servant in the Privy Council Office and in other agencies of the federal government. Madame Morin, je vous passe donc la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Stephen, pour cette introduction. Mesdames et messieurs, bon après-midi. Merci de vous être joints à nous pour ce panel. I'm very pleased that you have taken the initiative of inviting us today. I think that the relationship between Canada and the Caribbean region is one that merits attention and discussion. It is anchored in very long-standing historical ties, as we all recognized. And you have talked about the financial services area, of course, which is very important in our bilateral relationship. But frankly, it is also so much more. I would like to say that the people-to-people relationship, for example, are also incredibly broad and very long-standing. The broader economic relationship is also very important. And in general, I think it is good to ask ourselves, we have done so well up to now, how can we ensure to do as well into the future and to do even better? I come to this panel having just a few months ago left the bank, having had the great privilege of representing 11 Caribbean countries at the bank. So I will take this opportunity at the end of the panel of sharing with you how we work together with and as representative on behalf of Caribbean countries in a multilateral context as well, because in as much as the bilateral relationships are very important, I think our ability to work together in a multilateral context also has to be appreciated and discussed. I'm delighted to see in this room many distinguished former colleagues of mine, including some former high commissioners. So I want to salute them, and former Director General of the region. I am sure that they will want to add also their thoughts on our deliberation this afternoon. So I would like to bid a very warm welcome to High Commissioner Harry Naubat from Guyana, and I had the pleasure of representing your country at the World Bank, High Commissioner. And also a warm welcome to Mr. Phil Rourke. Phil and I have known each other for just a few years, right, Phil? maybe going on to 25 or something like this? Yes. So we can say that we have a relationship? Okay, very good. So Phil is Executive Director at the Center for Trade Policy and Law, which I think all of you or most of you would be familiar with. And he also accumulates function as a Principal Advisor at the Shridat Rampal Center in Barbados. And Phil, you have also had a very long association with the region. So I propose to first turn to High Commissioner Nabas, who will share with us his perspective on the relationship between Canada and the region. And then I think that Mr. Rourke will want to share with us his views as to where we stand on the Canada CARICOM FTA negotiations. And as I mentioned, I will come back at the end and try to share with you the work that we have done or are doing at the World Bank. So thank you very much for being here. And I will now turn to High Commissioner Nabas to get the discussion going. Please, sir.
Thank you. First of all, let me say I didn't realize until Madam spoke that I was in such esteemed company, former High Commissioners, heads of department, Directors General. I hope I'm not lost. First of all, I need to say thanks for the invitation, especially to Professor Stephen Baranyi. Did I call it right? He has been after me for approximately a month to get prepared for this discussion. I was visiting certain parts of Canada, and therefore only for the last week I got down to some serious thoughts.
Could you speak closer into the microphone?
I'm sorry.
That's better.
It's all over now.
I'll fix it. Madam Mora, is that correct too? My friend Phil Rourke, who I've known not for 25 years, but for about 2 years, maybe? Just over 2 years. Yes, we're working on it 25 years. Mr. John Graham, who I also know for over 2 years, and all those in attendance, as I said, those esteemed gentlemen and ladies. I should indicate at the outset that while I was invited in my capacity as current Dean of CARICOM member states represented in Canada, much of what I have to say about the negotiations will draw from the experiences of my own country, Guyana, as well as the considered views of some of my CARICOM diplomatic colleagues in Ottawa. I was told, I think I saw someone from Barbados. The High Commission of Barbados is represented here, and the High Commissions of Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. In fact, the High Commission of Jamaica is supposed to be here. I hope she didn't get lost, as I nearly did. I got to address 120 University, and the GPS was taking me to Carleton. Oh, I have a colleague here who also had that experience. Eventually, we decided that we were going to come to University of Ottawa, whether we were lost or not. Nevertheless, the views I express on the subject are mine and do not represent the position or opinion of any other person, organization, or member state of CARICOM. With regard to diplomatic relations, all member states of CARICOM enjoy long-standing cordial relations with Canada. Most CARICOM member states would have established diplomatic relations with Canada immediately after attaining political independence. In at least 2 cases, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, 50+ years ago, and for Guyana, almost 48 years. 6 CARICOM member states, Guyana, Haiti, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago, have accredited resident diplomatic missions in Ottawa. I know at least one other member state of CARICOM, Suriname, which has accredited a non-resident ambassador based in Washington. Up to about 3 years ago, the OECS, the Organization of Caribbean States, Eastern Caribbean States, also had a resident High Commissioner in this capital. Canada has resident diplomatic missions in 5 CARICOM member states, namely Guyana, Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, and Trinidad and Tobago. With Her Excellency, the High Commissioner to Guyana, also accredited to the CARICOM Secretariat in Georgetown and Suriname, and the High Commissioner to Barbados, accredited to most of the OECS member states. The English-speaking CARICOM member states, former British colonies, and Canada are members of the Commonwealth, as well as many other hemispheric organizations, including the OAS, and international organizations such as the UN, and the WTO. There are also strong cultural ties between CARICOM and Canada. In 2006, it was estimated that there were 390,000 plus residents in Canada who originated from the 15 CARICOM countries, according to Statistics Canada. Caribbean authors and artists have also influenced the Canadian cultural landscape. Now, with respect to the trade relations, which is what I think you invited me to speak on, but you also said that I should mention the broader Canada-CARICOM relations. Trade and economic relations between CARICOM and Canada have a long history, dating back to the early 18th century, when the British North Atlantic colonies exchanged fish, lumber, and other staples for West Indian rum, molasses, and spices. I may add that our Caribbean rum helped to warm many Canadians during your winters and put a spring in your steps during the summers, while salted cod was a welcome addition to our menu in the Caribbean. Currently, trade and economic cooperation relations are covered under a number of instruments, namely the 1979 CARICOM Canada Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement and its protocols, including the 1998 Protocol on Rum, CARICOM, which was in 1986, which grants unilateral duty-free access to eligible goods from beneficiary countries in the English-speaking Caribbean, and bilateral investment treaties with individual member states, namely Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago. It has been recognized, however, that current non-reciprocal preferential programs such as CARICOM and the General Preference Tariff Scheme, GPT, do not provide an adequate and secure foundation on which to anchor the region's future trade and economic relations with Canada, and for bringing dynamism to CARICOM export performance vis-a-vis Canada. CARICOM's relative value for CARICOM beneficiaries has been reduced since it was first introduced in 1986 due to progressive market liberalization by Canada as a result of bilateral trade agreements and/or unilateral initiatives, as well as further market liberalization undertaken by Canada in the context of the WTO multilateral negotiations, example the Uruguay round and the ongoing Doha development negotiations. In 2011, Canada secured a new WTO waiver, which permitted the continuation of the CARICOM preferences for 2 years until December 31st, 2013. For both Canada and CARICOM, this should have allowed sufficient time within which to conclude their bilateral negotiations of the Trade and Development Agreement. But, as is now known, the negotiations are still to be concluded. However, though the waiver has expired, the preferences remain in place pending the conclusion of the current negotiations. The difficulties associated with obtaining the support of the WTO membership of a waiver to continue the life of the CARICOM preferential arrangement provides strong motivation to lock in the existing preferences and preferential margins in a new trade arrangement, which provides long-term security and predictability for traders and investors. In 2001, CARICOM heads of government proposed to their Canadian counterpart the negotiation of a more mature trading relationship, which builds on and enhances existing arrangements and fulfills the objective of the economic development of CARICOM countries. CARICOM's broad objectives in negotiating such an agreement with Canada are: 1, to build on and broaden the scope of the current instruments and programs of trade and economic cooperation, to deepen disciplines to improve market access for CARICOM exports of goods and services, while providing a more secure and predictable foundation for bilateral trade. 3, to stimulate increased flows of Canadian investments into the region. And 4, to provide a comprehensive framework for development cooperation initiatives. At the meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister in July 2007, CARICOM heads of government were of the opinion that negotiations with Canada should result in an economic partnership agreement rather than a strict free trade agreement. In subsequent exploratory discussions, Canadian senior officials expressed discomfort with the term economic partnership agreement, indicating a preference for the term trade and development agreement, which they indicated was a more suitable nomenclature. Canada and CARICOM commenced formal negotiations for a free trade and development agreement on November the 10th, that continued to November the 12th, 2009. CARICOM's assessment. In a CARICOM mandated study on the impact of Canada-CARICOM tariff liberalization 2008, it is noted that CARICOM and Canada have different motivations for signing an FTA. On the Canadian side, the motivations largely stem from the need to maintain export competitiveness with other exporters to the Western Hemisphere, that is, the US and Latin America. On the CARICOM side, the motivations are largely driven by non-goods consideration, example, in services and investments, as Canada is neither a major source of imports or a major market for CARICOM exports and goods. The CARICOM study also revealed that due to the low Canada most favored nation tariffs on major CARICOM exports on one hand, and the low share of Canada's imports to the region on the other, the costs and benefits from tariff liberalization, which is reduction or elimination of tariffs alone, are unlikely to be significant if the region concedes more or less the same level of liberalization under the EPA, which is the Economic Partnership Agreement with Europe. If the region concedes deeper than EPA liberalization on a wide range of goods, the impact of the EPA most favored nation clause could lead to strong tariff revenue and welfare losses, provided that there should be strong trade diversion towards duty-free imports from Canada. The EPA MFN will require CARICOM countries to extend any better treatment in goods, tariffs, or service provisions they extend to Canada to be also given to the EU. Given the low estimated benefit from tariff liberalization, other areas of the agreement could provide benefits for the region, particularly services, investment, and development cooperation. Against a concern in the level of development cooperation provided by Canada to CARICOM, the region sought a separate adjustment fund under the agreement so as to reverse Canada's stance that development cooperation should be separated from trade negotiations. And we have that development cooperation with CEDA, where $600 million was earmarked for CARICOM's development. After half the time, it's extended out to 12 years instead of 10. I think just over 50% have been disbursed. Potential export benefits for CARICOM. The study found that a loss of tariff preferences based on the trade for 1997 to 2006 on the CARICOM would not lead to significant amounts of tariff duty being paid on CARICOM exports. Of the nearly US $700 million worth of CARICOM exports to Canada, some $64 million worth of exports would be dutyable if the CARICOM waiver were not to be renewed. This would result in approximately $2.2 million worth of annual tariff duty that would be paid by CARICOM exporters with three products: methanol from Trinidad and Tobago, $1.6 million, lobster from Bahamas, Haiti, and Belize, $345,000, and ethyl alcohol from Guyana, $143,000, accounting for nearly all of the potential duty. These figures can be conversely seen as the duty savings if CARICOM were to end and Canada grant duty-free, quota-free access to CARICOM. The study also found that export benefits for CARICOM can be affected in 5 scenarios: 2 beneficial, 2 negatively, and 1 of no effect. I wouldn't go into them right now. Guyana's assessment. The CARICOM-wide assessment is also relevant for Guyana. With respect to tariff, A, 95% of Guyana's exports to Canada is gold, on which there is a most favored nation exemption equivalent to 0% duty. Almost all of Guyana's other exports to Canada also have 0 MFN rates. In addition, all other currently exported products can enter duty-free under CARICOM and or GPT and could be affected once CARICOM is ended. Example, ethanol and such products. There would be no major revenue concerns due to tariff reductions for Guyana if CARICOM were to conclude an FTA with Canada. Some products would currently face duties but are not exported. An FTA could increase exports for such product. The only realistic example is garments, but potential for Guyana is probably low for several reasons. Concerning Guyana's major exports, rum, under 3% exports to Canada, enters duty-free under GSP or CARICOM, but specific duty on the MFN, most favored nation. But, however, there are market barriers at the provincial level, and these have continued to be problematic. 2 other major exports for Guyana are sugar and rice. Canada operates almost on world market level with low import barriers. There is no preferential access to be gained. And on rice, there's the MFN of 0% duty. The current state of play. The 2 sides last met in their 7th round of negotiations during June the 16th to the 21st this year. The 7th round resulted in many areas of agreement and the closure of a number of chapters, particularly in light of the flexibilities tabled by both sides. At the same time, Canadian negotiators had indicated that their negotiating mandate will expire unless the 2 sides were able to finalize an agreement in principle proposed by Canada by the end of June. In some cases, agreement on the outstanding chapters is dependent on the resolution of negotiations in other chapters or other issues under negotiation. For example, competition policy. While in other cases, agreement requires inputs from member states within CARICOM and further negotiating instructions, for example, trade-related cooperation and labor. The major areas that remain outstanding in the negotiations are those related to tariff liberalization, trade in goods, and trade in services, including financial services and temporary entry. For example, if a Grenadian doctor wants to enter Canada to perform a surgery, temporary entry, and investment, which are dependent on the resolution of outstanding issues relating to liberalization, modalities, and architecture. In many of the outstanding areas, inputs from member states are required in order to consolidate the CARICOM position and make consequent textual adjustments, while others require flexibility on either or both sides. The proposed agreement in principle would outline the policy approach to be taken on all outstanding issues and identify the technical work to be completed within an agreed time frame. Example, the drafting of legal texts and the finalization of national individual country liberalization schedules. With respect to tariff liberalization, the agreement in principle further includes a revised proposals on Canada's tariff liberalization, which grants CARICOM member states immediate duty-free access for most products. And it proposes that the LDCs, the OECM members, Belize and Haiti, make no further commitments on liberalization beyond those tabled by CARICOM at the end of the 6th round in April 2014. That the MDCs of CARICOM agreed to undertake further commitments by giving EPA party treatment on a list of products which are liberalized in the Economic Partnership Agreement with the European Union. This is a significant modification of Canada's earlier position. With regard to modalities for services and investment liberalization, Canada, having rejected CARICOM's proposal, firstly on a positive list approach and subsequently on an enhanced positive list, presented a revised proposal during the 7th round, which, while anchored in the principles of its preferred negative list, includes flexibilities that will simplify the schedule CARICOM member states will have to submit and allow for carve-out for sensitive sectors included in the future. Canada prefers the negative lists, which means that a list you don't wish to liberalize. CARICOM prefers the positive listing. The problem for the small CARICOM with negative list approach is that we would be unable to exclude future sectors or industries that are not yet known. Significant progress has also been made in alcoholic beverages. The text on the table is fully agreed to by the West Indies Rum and Spirits Association. Immediate next steps. Following consultations between the Prime Minister of Jamaica in her capacity as CARICOM Prime Ministerial Lead for External Trade Negotiations and the Prime Minister of Canada, the two sides have agreed that CARICOM will present a comprehensive response to Canada's proposed agreement in principle by the end of November 2014. That's this month end. Re-engaging Canada in the negotiations will require consensus on the outstanding areas of the negotiations in order to present a CARICOM closing package of proposals in response to the AIP. As a result of the seriousness with which CARICOM member states regard these negotiations, there are continuous deliberations within our regional bodies to formulate positions which would be acceptable to our individual countries and hopefully to Canada. And even as we speak today, these meetings are taking place. There's one such meeting that is supposed to be taking place today and tomorrow to submit proposals to the Ministers of Trade. I would also echo the sentiments expressed in some articles in the media that agreement will be reached between the negotiating parties, and this is supported by the compromise shown by the two sides at the last two rounds of negotiation. I was privy to observe such preparedness to compromise in Ottawa earlier this year during the 6th rounds. Canada and the CARICOM member states have shared values and positions for so many years that these must be worth compromise on both sides to benefit each other. For Canada, consideration must be given to the different stages of development of our individual member states, and for CARICOM, that the Canadian market is too important not to continue to get access to. Former Jamaican High Commissioner, in an interview with the Embassy newspaper before she left, was quoted as saying that the negotiations have not been successful, but things will sort themselves in the end. I look forward to her optimism being vindicated. For my own self, I suspect this might be my last winter in Canada, having been here for 5 winters, 4 calendar years, and I would hope that before I leave, that there is movement on both sides so that we could conclude this agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for your sense of optimism, and you will miss those Canadian winters. You will. So thank you for that, and I would like now to pass on the floor to Mr. Phil Rourke. Do you want to just hold the mic, Phil, or
I
you
can
want
do that.
Okay, well,
I'll see
here's
what
the whole
happens.
apparatus.
Give you both options.
I see the problem. Thanks, Marie-Lucie, and thanks, High Commissioner, for an excellent introduction.
Before you speak, there's a seat in front. Is the Jamaican High Commissioner seated? Okay.
it's like church. You got to sit up front if you're, and nobody wants to. Thanks very much, Lucie, for the introduction, and High Commissioner for giving the very detailed briefing on where we are and how we might be able to move forward. What I thought I'd do in my few minutes is to start off where you've left off, High Commissioner, and try to look at it from a little higher up, 10 or 20 feet up, and say, okay, what's going on? Why has it been, frankly, a little difficult over the last 7 years to get a deal that lots of people thought wouldn't take that long? And in that, are there some grains of knowledge and insight that we can gain in order to move forward and make sure that you leave your post with, well, warm and having a mission accomplished? So it took 7 years. And it's still not finished. I'm glad to hear, and I was down in the Caribbean a few weeks ago, that they're frantically working on both sides to try to use this opportunity, and it's probably the last one, but this opportunity to re-engage, to find a deal in the next little while. So let's unpack it a little bit and see what's going on and how do we move forward. First, if you hang out with trade people long enough, the first thing you tend to understand is that it's all about interests. It's all about interests because we're talking about money, and we're talking about market share, and we're talking about people who don't want to give up market share or want to grow market share. So all foreign policy is about interest, but it's the commercial interests that make people think right from the beginning what's in there and what really, as economists would say, what are the problems and how do we solve them? What are the alternatives to solving them? And can we figure out a creative way to put everything together? The problem, which shouldn't be a problem in a way if you think about it, but the problem of getting an agreement from the beginning was that the trade and economic relationship was working fairly well in 2007 and up to that point. We did have this preferential trade agreement, but as we heard in the remarks from the High Commissioner, it wasn't enough. There wasn't really a problem there. And if you look at the tariff rates that are affected, or the goods that are affected, there are other factors that probably have more of an impact in terms of the trade relationship, foreign exchange rates, competitiveness rates, and so on, that have more of a factor on whether you have trade or not than the tariff. So it was hard to figure out what was the problem, what we were trying to solve with this trade agreement, and therefore where are the commonalities. Second, if you don't have lots of interests to solve and problems to solve, it's hard to sort of put together a coherent strategy. So both sides said, okay, we've got these mandates from our government or from the ministers. How do we put this together? What is the strategy? What are we trying to achieve? The Caribbean had it especially difficult because they had just gone through a very exhausting and difficult process with Europe, trying to come up with an agreement that was difficult, probably difficult politically for governments to sell once they had gotten a deal. And so I can understand it. They were a little reticent about being ambitious. And they were especially reticent about trying to sort of solve the different problems and different perspectives of the countries that were being a part of it. So the negotiating team, particularly in the Caribbean, had a very difficult job because they were pulled back even more than negotiators tend to be by, of course, the different governments who wanted to put them on a very short leash in terms of what they could do. So it's very difficult to put together a strategy if you have not a lot of flexibility in sort of shaping that strategy. In Canada, it was a little easier. We had a new government. The government was interested and had launched an America's strategy, and this seemed to fit. Having a trade deal with CARICOM fit the template that we were also looking at in Canada for the rest of the Americas, and so other countries such as Peru, Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, Panama, and so on. But how do you put this together? Because it's a whole different, in lots of ways, it's very different. So the basic strategy was to take the agreement that we had with so-called NAFTA, North American Trade Agreement, and the evolution of that, whether it was with our deal, Canada's deal with Colombia or Peru, and then with Honduras, and say, okay, Caribbean, CARICOM, here is our approach. It's this template that we've developed over the last 20 years. How do we put that onto, this is where we're coming from, how does that fit into what's of interest to you? Unfortunately, it's a very good template if you have big countries and with lots of export potential. It's not very good when you have 15 countries that are very small and don't have a lot of export opportunities. As the High Commissioner was saying, it's not about manufactured goods, it's about the evolution of the services sector in the Caribbean and trying to make it competitive over the longer term. So we have a problem with strategy on both sides. On the Canadian side, we're using a template that's probably too big of a hammer to fit and too big of a model to fit what the capacities of the Caribbean. And on the Caribbean side, they're coming back from the experience with Europe and saying, well, we really want to tone this down a little bit. Then the politics. The politics worked well. We have, as we've heard from both speakers, good relations on both sides, but nothing really, again, to solve. So how do you sort of fit that in? And everybody's busy with all kinds of other things. And then finally, it's about development. And really, Canada was coming with this NAFTA template, and so thinking first trade and then development. And Caribbean was thinking development and then trade. So you put it all together, and you basically, if you're in the Caribbean, these negotiations are probably, in terms of a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being most important, probably 2, because you're trying to deal primarily first with Europe and the aftershock of that. In Canada, it's about 8. So, because we have all kinds of other strategies and negotiations going on. So 2, 8, it's already difficult to figure it out. Fast forward to right now, and how do we put together a deal? Well, the interests are probably the same. It's not going to affect Canada in any way, a deal. And the agreement that they have in principle right now has basically carved out it having a negative impact on the very small countries of the OECS, and probably addresses many of the interests of the larger countries, but there's still, as we heard, some differences. On strategy, I think they've come up with a pretty good model that now works. It's what I find interesting from the Canadian perspective is the future growth, and the future growth also for the Caribbean is in the developing world, however you define it. It's not in the developed countries. So we have to find a better template, and we have to find a better strategy. And one thing I do know is that the negotiators on both sides are very professional and very good and very creative. They have lots of ideas that I personally want to see, because these ideas will then find themselves into trade agreements in the future. Because they seem to be good creative solutions to some of the issues that affect developed and developing countries alike. Politics, we'll see, but we do have an election coming on, and I think there's a few, as we all know, the Caribbean community is concentrated in places where lots of parties, or all 3 parties, are interested in getting some seats, and it's highly contested. Maybe that has a factor, I don't know. Finally, I think what is interesting is that whether you call it a trade agreement or a trade and development agreement, it is a trade and development agreement. As we all know in this room, Canada is trying to figure out how you put our foreign policy, our trade policies, and development policies together. This is probably going to be the first template of how those things all fit together. And so we're getting there. It's taking a little longer, but I think there's pieces there to put together. So next steps, we'll see in the next 3 or 4 months. I'm actually optimistic, because if you think about it, there are ways to put this together. I think the negotiators on both sides know what it looks like. They just have to convince the people on top that it is in their interests and that it will work. So, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Phil, for those remarks. I should mention that I was actually Deputy Minister of Trade, of International Trade, when the mandate to launch those negotiations was put forward. So, of course, I followed this very closely for a few years, and then I went away. So now I feel that I'm absolutely up to date as to where we are. So thank you, you two, for that. And Phil, you've mentioned that we will have elections in Canada between definitely by the end of October next year. I should add that there's also always an election going on somewhere in the Caribbean, right, High Commissioner, or one or two or three. So, so that is not inconsequential as well. But I hear a wind of optimism here coming out of our two panelists. I'm liking hearing that. So you will have the opportunity to ask questions specifically about the FTA, but bear with me to come back a little bit to the broad context of the region, because it is not inconsequential with respect to how these negotiations might evolve. So I wanted to share with you a little bit my perspective of having represented 11 countries of the region for over 3 years, and also give you a sense of what kind of work an organization like the World Bank, together with the IADB and the CDB, what kind of work it does in the region. And that work, by the way, is very much aligned with the priorities that CEDA, for example, has given to the region in terms of its programming for the 10-year period that, High Commissioner, you've alluded to. So I think, Stephen, in your introduction, you alluded to the fact that the Caribbean region has suffered severely as a result of the great financial crises. And I think that this is a good start point for us. Suffered greatly as a whole, unevenly, because clearly some countries have done better coming out of this financial recession than others. But I think it's fair to say that the region as a whole has had difficulty rebounding from 2006 and are still very much feeling the effect of this crisis. So what we have had in the region is a long period of slow or negative growth, again, with some exceptions, and I think you hail from a country which is an exception to that. But this has had a major impact on an already high indebtedness, and of course has had some very negative consequences, for example, on the labor market and employment, which is a major factor, right? When you add to that the region's perennial vulnerability to natural disasters, which has, you know, depending on the countries, greatly added to the economic vulnerability, you are looking at a region which has not gone through a very sort of, I would call it, prosperous time in the last few years. So what has the World Bank and its partner organizations done in response to this overall situation? Well, the work of the bank has very much sort of focused on economic growth, on trying to help the region and individual countries manage its debt, and also improving disaster risk management. And this has been done, of course, multilaterally, but I would have to add with very strong support and involvement of Canada, not only as a representative for many of the countries, but also as a partner, because there exists, in addition to the core funding at the World Bank, for example, trust funds to which, you know, we are able to contribute in addition to. A very interesting initiative which is was put forward in 2012 and continues to this day is the Caribbean Growth Forum. So a platform led by the bank together with the IADB and the CDB, again, very much supported by Canada, which has led to the creation of 12 national chapters, very much focusing on how to improve the investment climate, skills, and productivity in the region. This has been run as a grassroots kind of process, and I've participated in some of the national chapters deliberations. On the whole, in the region, there have been more than 3,000 participants to this, and the process has identified 400 separate reforms to be carried out in 12 countries. So it's been a very, very positive process. Another issue in the region, of course, is around energy. The cost of electricity in the region is high, and there's a very, I would call it, volatile generation mix, which is almost entirely, and again, some countries are exceptions to this, but dependent on import of fuel. So there are opportunities that exist to greatly improve energy efficiency, and then to realize, when we look into the future, significant energy potential integration regionally. We have to look at the regulatory framework around energy and frankly, build economies of scale. That energy equation is very, very critical when we look at the development of the region into the future. Another aspect is how one could use PPPs in the region to really make sure that we have, the implementation of significant projects. There is a growing interest for PPPs. This is an area, by the way, where Canada is truly a global leader. So the bank, working with bilateral partners with Canada, has been looking at what are the constraints to using PPPs at the national level in the various countries and then regionally. Been providing technical assistance, for example. In the area of debt management, the bank has very much been working with the IMF. I have to say that the Commonwealth ministers have been active in this area as well. So I've already said that the public debt levels are very high across the Caribbean region. So the countries have come together around what I would call a comprehensive debt management program, whereby they have asked the multilateral institutions to help promote private sector growth, strengthen fiscal management in country, which is, of course, very critical, to build resilience in matters of natural disasters, and I'll come to as to why this is very much part of debt management in a moment, and to work on different models of debt resolution. The next and last area that I very much want to mention is that of disaster risk management. The impact of physical as well as financial, I would say, occurrences since 1980 has been such that, if I recall, there have been about 8 or 9 countries which have experienced disasters, events that have had an economic impact greater than 50% of annual GDP. And you might recall, in the case of Grenada, I think it was, High Commissioner, there was a hurricane that hit. I want to say that this was 7 years ago, was it? And I think that in that particular case, and don't quote me on this, but I think that it wiped out nearly 100% of GDP in a single occurrence. So the bank has very much been working with individual countries and improving the risk management framework around that, around four 4 separate pillars. The first one being understanding the risk. The second one is, of course, working on risk reduction. And how do you do that? Obviously, it's through retrofitting, for example, and looking at social safety nets, because when these disasters hit, you have to be able to respond vis-à-vis your population in a very sort of timely manner. And then looking at risk financing and at financial protection strategies. The bank has also put in place what has been a very, very successful insurance program called the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Inception Facility. It is now in its 8th year of operation, if I recall correctly, and it is now being expanded to include Central America. So I wanted to share that with you because I think it gives you a good sense of what is going on in the region. I would tell you that I'm personally very optimistic vis-à-vis the region because there is good leadership. I think that we see also entrepreneurship growing in the region. I think that we will see some very interesting regional initiatives occurring as well, including in the area of logistics, because this is very, very important as to how you're able to take a more holistic approach to moving goods and people around, for example. So it is a region which is not only a wonderful region from a people-to-people perspective, or just for getting away from winter, since we have to get back to that. But there is unrealized economic potential in the region, and I'm personally looking forward to continuing my involvement in it. So I think with those comments, I would like to ask if somebody would like to intervene, and I would ask you to perhaps identify yourself. And we have, do we have a second microphone? We have a second microphone there, and you can direct your comments or questions to either of our distinguished panelists, please. Well, we were brilliant.
Mm-hmm. It's always the first one. It's always the first question.
Hello, my name is Gregory Evanick. I'm the president of the Royal Commonwealth Society. And one of the things I find interesting is the role of civil societies in some of the goals that are national goals. What roles do you see the civil society can play in achieving trade and other disaster relief activities?
Interesting question. I think that one observation I've had working in and out of Caribbean and the changes I've seen over the last little while is, and maybe it's because I work at a university there, so you always get to see where things are coming or where the change is happening. There's a greater interest in finding non-governmental solutions to problems. It makes a lot of sense when you have countries that only relatively recently became independent to have a large public sector. But the public sector is moving out for debt reasons, for all kinds of different reasons, and other groups and individuals are moving in to try to figure out some of these problems and potential solutions. So, for example, I work with some master's students in trade and development at UE in Barbados. And 5 years ago, they would be thinking, I want to work for the government or I want to work for a business association. And move through the system, as lots of people at this school and at Carleton also want to do. Over the last 3 or 4 years, a lot more of them are becoming more, just like you see students here, a lot more practical and thinking, well, I'm still interested in international trade, I'm still interested in international affairs, I'm still interested in making a contribution to the region, but I don't necessarily think that government's the only place to go to figure that out. They don't have the money and the mechanisms to actually capitalize on the ideas that they have, but they're searching for those kinds of things. So I think it'll take a little while, but you see that happening. You see the biggest change I see in Barbados is the movement of Trinidad companies moving in and changing the dynamics of how the private sectors is organized. You see some actual examples of Caribbean-based firms making gains even in this market. You go into Shoppers Drug Mart, everybody's interested in coconut water because it's like the new Gatorade without all the sugar or something like that. And you can pick one up and it says Grace Kennedy. And it's Grace Kennedy, and then you turn it around, and we do this in trade class, you turn around, Grace Kennedy, manufactured for Grace Kennedy, based in Jamaica, product of Thailand. Now, is that a good outcome or a bad one? I think 5 or 10 years ago, people would have said that's a bad outcome because Grace Kennedy should be producing these things and producing coconuts, turning it into water that you then sell in Canada. I think, and lots of the students and the profs in Barbados say this is a good thing. They're trying to figure out what are their relative strengths. We're a distribution company. We're not necessarily somebody just making goods, and we're taking advantage and building our business from the region and outside. Same with a whole bunch of Trinidadian companies are doing the same thing. So these things are not leading to the big gains that you want to see right away, but there's these little pieces that show a little bit of optimism, as Malgré was saying.
Could I just add to that, Grace Kennedy? By the way, we have the Jamaican High Commissioner with us here. She has arrived in Canada to take up her appointment a month ago, just over a month ago. So we'd like to welcome her. But just to add to the Grace Kennedy reference you made, we have in Canada being sold a sugar packaged named Demerara sugar. And when you look carefully, it's made in Mauritius. But Demerara is a region in Guyana. The other thing about civil society that the gentleman asked is that Madam mentioned Grenada, but you failed to mention Haiti, which had devastating effects a couple of years ago. In Guyana, we lost 60% of our GDP in 2005 when we had a massive flood. We have flooding right now, again, in Guyana. I see this young lady shaking her head. I'm sure she's from Guyana. Or Jamaica. But in all of those situations, we have had tremendous assistance from civil society. In fact, civil society not only in Guyana, NGOs not only in Guyana, but in our diaspora, in Canada, in the US, in the UK, we have had people coming together to raise funds to assist their former brothers and sisters who've suffered, not only in Guyana, but in every single Caribbean country. We have diaspora organizations that go to the aid whenever there's an assistance. I mean, it's not enough, but it still is something to help.
I just wanted to add a word or two with respect to the agricultural sector, since it was mentioned. We certainly, when I was at the bank, thought that this was a sector which could hold a lot of promise in the region in terms of integrating the agricultural sector together with the tourism sector. And we certainly observed that there was growing interest in many countries. And looking at organic growing, for example, and crop diversification and so on and so forth. So just a comment on the type of entrepreneurship that I was mentioning earlier, which I think could be very promising for the future.
Thank you. The last time this group dealt with the Caribbean in any depth was probably about a couple of years ago, I guess. And one of the subjects that came up, matter of fact, was quite prominent at that time, was the issue of security. And I think the sense was that some of the Caribbean countries were being affected partly by international drug trade between Colombia, Central America, Mexico, and eventually North America. And some of it simply was local. So I wonder if you could comment on the situation today with respect to security, and just maybe comment very briefly on why this is, if it is still an issue, why it is an issue still. Thanks.
Actually, briefly, security is an issue, and there's no use denying it. But for Guyana's sake, for Guyana's purposes, our borders stretch from Suriname, Brazil, Venezuela, and they're very porous. We don't have the capacity to monitor those borders on a full-time basis like the Americans or the Canadians would do. So there is cross-border drug trafficking, there is. But we have been doing a lot of work on our own, in addition to which the United States have been assisting us to secure those borders and to try as far as possible to prevent the scourge of drugs within our country, and not only in our country, in the entire Caribbean. The United States has special task force that operate within Caribbean waters. Okay? You want it? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for very interesting presentations. First, a pointed question on this link between development cooperation, or ODA, and trade facilitation. In previous analyses of the negotiations between the Caribbean and Canada, there were suggestions that one of the obstacles to concluding agreement was a demand by the Caribbean that the commitment to development assistance, which was at the time $600 million over 10 years, be extended into the future. I think increased and extended was the ask. Interestingly, that didn't come up on your short list, your combined short list of outstanding items. So perhaps that's because Caribbean positions have changed in that regard. Is it because they took Phil Rourke up on his suggestion that instead of asking for more money, the Caribbean should use the money that is there in a more strategic manner? And one of the things you suggested, Phil, in one of your analyses was that more of certainly a larger percentage of the unspent, undispersed money from that $600 million on an annual basis be directed towards trade facilitation. Can you tell us, both of you, a little bit more about what Canada might do in the way of promoting synergies between development cooperation or aid and trade facilitation with the money that is already on the table? And secondly, related to that, very quickly, gender. We haven't talked about it. I can't believe it at this university. We haven't yet talked about that. And yet, in its evaluation of previous 6 years of development cooperation between Canada and the CARICOM, ex-CETA concluded that Canada had achieved mixed results in this area and should do more to capitalize on Canada's, and I quote, comparative advantage in this domain. Well, what could be done? What has been done since then? if you know a little bit about that, or what could be done to, again, weave gender equality in very creatively into the next generation of our development cooperation, particularly as it links up to trade facilitation. For example, to enabling women entrepreneurs to forge strategic partnerships to access Canadian markets. Thanks.
If I could just answer the first question you asked with respect to the movement of positions by Canada and the Caribbean on the development aspect of the agreement. My understanding is, coming out of the April 2014 round of negotiations in Canada, the sixth round, is that Canada has moved somewhat on the position of development in the way that they have been considering a separate MOU to deal with development assistance. This isn't a firm decision as yet, but Canada has moved somewhere towards having a separate agreement on development assistance. The 600 million has addressed in many Caribbean countries the question of gender, because money has been spent in areas to deal with gender. I'm not too certain about whether it has any relationship to trade, but certainly entrepreneurship has been addressed as part of the 600 million in many Caribbean countries.
Thanks for the question. The question of development cooperation and what Canada should do. First of all, there are a number of donors that are doing lots of work already in the Caribbean. The European agreement provided hundreds of millions of dollars to support the implementation and the capacity building issues related to implementing the trade agreement between Europe and the Caribbean. And those are having a number of challenges already. They just did a review over 5 years and said, well, implementation is taking a lot longer than we expected. And so the money is there, they're making lots of effort, and some of it is just beginning to show some results. So first of all, there's a crowded agenda. It's not just Europe. Germany's providing money, the Regional Development Bank, and it's sort of on the supply side in terms of infrastructure and so on. So there's a number of initiatives going on. Second, you're going to have to take this part with a grain of salt, because I have a complete self-interest in advertising this, but I really think, only because this is what I do for a living, I do trade capacity building for a living. You heard the High Commissioner say the growth area is in the services sector. And so if that is in fact the growth sector, but the real problem, and the problem of the negotiations in general, is the capacity to trade and the capacity to be competitive domestically, and then ability to actually export. So you're also in the services sector, you're not talking about, you know, the hotels chains and so on. They don't need help. It is very small, medium-sized enterprises who are only beginning to figure out how to be competitive in their own market before they start being internationally competitive. And it's very difficult in some of the areas where they want to get in. It's very difficult to see, for all kinds of reasons, technically on the trade side, for them to not only get into the Canadian market or other markets, and then also continue to be competitive there. So there's lots of stuff that has to get out of the way and sort of fixed before you'll actually see some results. We're focused on the negotiations, but the one thing you learn when you're into trade is that all we're talking about right now is the framework for regulating trade between Canada and the Caribbean. It's then the private sector that has to take that. So it's both the government and the private sector involved in trade, but it's the governments are talking about the framework, and then it's then up to the private sector to do something with it. So unlike other areas of development cooperation, you have a disconnect between government intentions and results. If the government of Canada wants to invest in the into the healthcare sector in the Caribbean, they can do that. And you can build hospitals, and you have public sector, and you can work directly with the government to implement that. But here, you're waiting for a whole other group of people to do something that you don't have any control over. And you deliberately don't have any control over. You want the private sector to engage. So it's very difficult to get into that. On trade and gender, I'm in the education business. Gender hits when you start saying access to knowledge, information, and education. You know, as one of my jobs at Caveville in Barbados is to try to get more students to take our program. Lots of them are interested. If you want to take the program, you have to come to Barbados and stay a year. And it's relatively expensive to go to Barbados. Lots of women have personal responsibilities, family responsibilities that stop them or make it just impossible for them to take a year off to come and take the program. So you start looking into online and different kinds of ways to provide access to women and other disadvantaged or poor people who don't have the same opportunities as the ones that traditionally take education. So the other area in trade and gender, it really is an undeveloped area when you start looking at the research and how you're going to deal with that. And consequently, you don't see a lot of results or projects and then results in that area.
Before you go, John, I was just given permission to invite the Jamaican High Commissioner if you need to add anything to what I've said. And I know that there's someone from Barbados, from the Barbados High Commission here. If either of you need to add anything to what any of us have said, please feel free. Thank you.
Indeed, indeed. Please do. John, I mean, yes, please.
Thanks. We're talking about gender and education, and a few years ago I did some research on Canada and the Caribbean, and one of the startling facts I found was what was happening in Jamaica. I think was the most special case that the University of the West Indies, the Mona campus, was graduating something like 80% females. That this was a particular problem in Jamaica, but I understand that it is represented in other parts of the Caribbean. A very serious problem with major social and economic consequences. I'm not quite sure how much has been done about it, whether the situation has been rectified, but a friend I asked who was in the Caribbean said as far as he was aware that there has not been a major change. The research, the preliminary research about this seemed to indicate that males drifted out of school, drifted out of the job market in adolescence. And it was a problem, it was a cultural problem that they had absorbed at a preschool age, particularly in families where there were single-parent families where the parent was almost invariably the mother. So I'm asking if the panelists or indeed the High Commissioner can help bring us up to date on what seems to be a very serious problem.
I'm not from the region. I can't really answer that question.
Actually, in Guyana, the situation is the same. We graduate more female from our university than male. And you were absolutely right when you say there's a problem, and it stems from the home situation. The male tend to gravitate into other areas other than schooling at a very early age, maybe just about secondary school age. They go into those areas for various reasons, and as a result of which, more female graduate from tertiary education institutions than male. Yes.
Please, the High Commissioner from Jamaica.
Yes, thank you very much. No, I just wanted to add, in relation to the last question, yes, it is true that you have more numbers of females at the University of the West Indies, Mona, more graduating. But I don't think any research has been done as to what happens afterwards. How many females are actually getting jobs as compared to males? How many females are in high-level positions as compared to males? And so you have to compare it and contrast it against that particular situation, because you have the numbers of women that are graduating, but if you look at the number of women who are in high-level positions, even in politics or in corporations or sitting on boards, the numbers are reversed.
Thank you for this wonderful gender perspective on the issue. We have time maybe for one more question. One or two. All right, we have one here and we have one in the back, and then I think that the High Commissioner has been very generous with his time. Please.
Hi, Judy McLean. Posted with the Foreign Service with John Graham, as a matter of fact, to Cuba way back when with my husband, and also a member of the Royal Commonwealth Society. Two memories come to mind, one happy and one not so happy. I'll go with the not so happy one first. At the Mayfield Theater, not too many years ago, there was a fabulous film, and I don't remember the name of it, of a Pan Am jet flying into Jamaica and going to fancy hotels, people coming down for their respite in the Caribbean. And it was killing off the dairy industry in Jamaica and the hot pepper industry, because everything was imported. It was a real monopoly by U.S. enterprises. This is a real problem. I don't know to what extent that has been mitigated now, so some of the local enterprises can get back into normal. I'd love to know about the dairy industry, because it had quite a revealing story about that. The other one is a happy memory with Phil. I think it was last year, Phil, when you brought in 3 of the scholarship students. I'd love to get an update. I think 2 were female, were they not?
Yeah, all 3.
All 3. How about that? Anyway, maybe you can give us an update on what's happened to them since.
Great. Good questions. On the food import bill is a question you hear throughout the region, and the cost of the food import bill. And it's not an easy solution in the Caribbean for a number of reasons. One is just tastes and getting used to certain things. One is a trade issue. You look at the tariffs on different kinds of foods, and they have a huge impact when you have huge differences on prices on what is consumed and what isn't. There's the capacity issue that NIDC referred to, the capacity to actually produce competitive goods, because it's not just an import question, it's a demand issue and or a production issue within the economies. For example, when you get to Barbados, a wonderful place, terrible place in lots of ways to try to grow a diversified crop. You're on coral, you have it's amazingly like the Canadian Shield, except completely different. It's all rock and then about this much of topsoil. And one of the reasons that sugarcane is there is it's basically a grass and it's relatively easy to grow. They're trying to get into it in a very serious way. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN and so on are looking at food security and the trade issues related, as you alluded to. But these are development questions. If you want to change what they sell in the resorts and so on that lots of us go to, it's not just a question of substituting it. It's we want 30 cases of tomatoes that look exactly like this every day for the next 40 days. Do you have the domestic capacity to do that? And can you be more competitive than the distribution networks that have been long established going through Miami and so on? These are difficult questions, and they're certainly not ones that you can solve in the short term. But it is a serious priority that you see all countries looking at. We had 3 there's actually a very good Canada CARICOM scholarship program that allows Caribbean students to spend some time in our country to get an education or to supplement their education or get some research and other kind of work-related experience. All 3 of them have good jobs. it's amazing how they got good jobs. I mean, in that there are very few of them, and so I was very lucky to find 3 who had everything they needed to get the jobs in the region, and I see them now as stakeholders that I go and consult, and it's an amazing experience to see graduates that you worked with now working and producing and working in the area that they wanted to actually.
And what are their positions now?
Caritha from St. Vincent is now a services sector analyst with Caribbean Export, so an international organization based in Barbados. That's a very good job. Aurelia Bruce had one job. She was working with the Services Coalition in Trinidad and Tobago. She was the creative one that with personality to burn. Most Trinis have personality to burn.
The short of the two.
Caritha was the really short one. And then Aurelia worked with the Coalition of Service Industries, and now she's working for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And Crystal Liverpool now works for the Trade Ministry of Trinidad and Tobago.
That is the problem we have sometimes. We train our people, and you take them.
Democracies are a wonderful thing.
Free movement of people, it's important. All right, our last question, please.
Thank you.
Sorry. Well, sorry. We'll have one more because somebody else had their... Go ahead, please.
Hi. Sorry. My name is Cynthia Curry, and I come at this from a slightly, I guess, a privileged position. Born in Guyana, worked in Jamaica, 2 powerhouses of the Caribbean, 2 agricultural powerhouses of the Caribbean. And so I was very pleased to see that finally we got around to a subject that sometimes never gets on the agenda, and that is agriculture. Because in the Caribbean, agriculture is a powerful industry in each of the countries. And I was going to ask the question, which I think has been partially answered, and that is, where are we in terms of the agricultural sector, both in terms of the Canadian side as well as the Caribbean side, in the FTA that's being negotiated? Are we progressing, and if so, the extent of the progress, or are we not? That's my question. But I would just like to, as I've got the mic, to just make a comment. And Madame Morin, I was very happy to hear you make the comments that you did with respect to risk management and the role that the bank has played in risk management in the Caribbean. I worked in Jamaica for 3 years, and it was at the time, I arrived in 2007 when Hurricane Dean devastated the country and devastated its agricultural industry. And I was able to go to the Canadian government, i.e. At the High Commission in Kingston, and get them to give us money to invest in the Jamaican agricultural industry, not in terms of doing what the Jamaicans have always done, but stepping it to a higher level. And that is training of farmers, and also the building of hurricane-resistant greenhouses. And we were very, very successful with that. Unfortunately, it was a finite amount of money with no and was not continued by CEDA, or the former CEDA. So that's the problem, is that, and for all of us who have been involved in international development, you know, you cannot have one-off projects and expect them to be successful. They are successful for a finite period of time, but if they are to be more successful in the longer term, there has to be a continuity, both in terms of the thinking of Canada vis-a-vis agriculture, and it has to be a thinking that is bigger than the traditional thinking. It's not just a matter of helping farmers. It's a matter of dealing with the youth who are working in the rural communities and who are entrepreneurs, but they're looking for assistance to help them grow their entrepreneurship. So I would just say to you that this is the area where I see development and trade being linked in a very, very positive manner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have a cold.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we'll also take the last question in the back, and then I will turn to the distinguished panelists. Okay. Please.
Mine just expands on that. My name is Emily. I'm the CARICOM desk officer, and I have to say I'm so happy to see 3 experts in front of me that can answer this question and do my homework for me. If you compare the Caribbean of today with the Caribbean of 5 to 10 years ago, would you say that things in the region are better on the whole, or is this a case of the more things change, the more they stay the same? Thanks.
If I could just attempt to address the first question with respect to agriculture in the Caribbean, I have a note here that says the study that was mandated by CARICOM, export benefits for CARICOM were unlikely to be impacted by the grant of a duty-free, quota-free minus. That is, if Canada were to exclude sensitive items sensitive to Canada, poultry, dairy, and agricultural products. Few of these products are currently exported by CARICOM outside the region. We have the capacity, I think, just to use what we produce, Guyana being an agriculture country and Jamaica, as you said as well. But we do a lot of export of pineapples, watermelons, and that type of things to Barbados because of the tourist industry that Barbados has. So in that we collaborate. But speaking for the CARICOM region as a whole, I don't think we export much of our agriculture products. We send ethnic products to the US, New York, Toronto, but in shipments by small aircraft, just to take care of the ethnic communities that we have in those capitals there, Toronto, New York, and so on. But export as a trade, large trade, I don't think we do it, except for rice and sugar, which are exported mainly for, I'm speaking about Guyana, to European countries, not necessarily to North American countries.
Thank you. On agriculture, I don't work for the government or either government, so I don't know what they're negotiating. But if you just look at the tariffs and what might or may not be affected by an agreement, some of the processed goods that the High Commissioner was talking about, those tariffs would be lower and therefore would make them more competitive here or maintain or keep the competitiveness here in the Canadian market. But that's only one part of the puzzle, and in fact, as you alluded to earlier, it's not the primary issue. The primary issue is the capacity to produce and be internationally competitive. Second, I think that I think we should look at more agriculture policies. I like some of the suggestions that CARICOM has made on cooperation on innovation policy between Canada and CARICOM in the future under this agreement or some other agreement. And that might create the conditions that we can look at innovations, because that's what has to be done. We have greenhouses here. Caribbean has shade houses. I love that name, shade houses. Only, of course, that's what you would have to sort of maintain the conditions that you want to increase the productivity. Ironically, it does make sense to build shade houses to improve agriculture in the region. There's also, and I'm not from the region, so I can't really speak to it, but what I hear in Barbados and elsewhere, there's a culture that makes it difficult sometimes for people to want to take meaningful work in the agricultural sector for the historical reasons of the slave trade and everything else, and the sort of baggage that remains because of that. And so there's a perception that agriculture is not always someplace that people want to get into, and you see that reflected. I was amazed. We were putting on a course with the World Trade Organization. I was amazed to see the relatively low level of government expenditure into agriculture. relative to other sectors of the economy. So part of the problem is the priority. What that tells me, and I'm not sure, as an inkling, but I'm not sure, it shows a bit where the government puts its priorities. And it was very small relative to money spent on industry and on services in other areas, and that probably reflects some of the priorities of the country. In terms of the bigger question, where do we go 5 years from now? Unfortunately, the indebtedness that Marie-Lucie referred to means that this isn't going to go away anytime soon. If you look at the government budgets for many of the countries in the Caribbean, they are going through a period of austerity, but they're still adding to the debt. And the debt as a percentage of GDP is in the same areas that we're talking about, and we've seen problems in Europe. But you're talking about economies that just can't get beaten up by financial crises the way our economy and others can, because we're more diversified and larger economies. So the impact of any change is amplified. So unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And then the question is, what can we do about that? I forget my last point.
I'm okay. No last word, High Commissioner?
I wish to say thanks to all who have been here for the questions that have been asked. I think that we possibly have a clearer understanding of CARICOM Canada trade relations and the way they're going. I hope we do. And I hope that in 4 months' time, is it 4 months or 6? In 6 months' time, that we'll have something that we could say that we could work with, both Canada and CARICOM. I look forward to that 6 months from now. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, and I could say that the Jamaican High Commissioner has been very helpful in the presentation that I've made. Even though I had a disclaimer before, but up to this morning she was telling me that we should put it in this direction, not in that direction. So thank you, Jamaican High Commissioner, and all the other CARICOM countries that have helped in the presentation. Thank you very much. It was good being here.
So, in my dual role as a moderator and a quasi-panelist, I would like to also thank you all for participating today, for your excellent questions. I think that they were, without exception, very, very good. But very importantly as well, I would like to thank High Commissioner Nabat and Mr. Rourke for making themselves available today. I think that we all gained a wonderful insight into what is going on in the region, and particularly with the state of affairs with respect to our bilateral negotiations. So thank you all, and join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.